Good morning, everyone. We're jumping into a new series. We're going to be talking about the character of David from the Old Testament. But just before we launch into that, I want to just remind us of the journey we've been on Sundays in terms of teaching content and what God really we believe, laid out for us this last year. We started at the beginning, the first series, with what we call the Vision series, and we looked at 3 different topics we really believe God was putting in front of our church and our community to kind of set as emphases for the year. And one was generational transfer. The second we talked about was connectivity, building better connectivity. And the third was building relevance to the world. And so that was the first series we started, and then we launched into another series right after that we called Reaching Out. And the whole idea was cultivating the Father's heart in us, and especially His passion for the lost. We felt like this was a real point of emphasis for this year and would be significant as the year unfolded. The third series we launched into was following a book study, and we talked about becoming emotionally healthy. And we believed that whatever was coming was going to require us growing significantly in emotional health. And if you remember, we began that series in person, and then COVID hit and we got shut down, and we finished it virtually. And then the fourth series was the letter to the Ephesians, when we talked about those big, amazing truths that God has laid out for us, and then focused in on the end of Ephesians on the very practical advice for how to live and how to live out our faith. And then in the fifth series, we looked at what we called Thinking of Heaven, that in light of all the current events and all of the stuff that's going on, we needed a reorientation. And we needed to fix our intention on what Paul calls the real reality. And so we looked at that for a few weeks, and now we're jumping into the next series that will take us right on all the way to Advent, which is on the life of David. We're calling this Lessons from the Life of David. And the goal of this series is really to try to learn and apply lessons that we learn from David's example. One of the genres in biblical literature is what we call biographical genre, and we learn from the lives and the characters and the stories of people, how God interacted with them, what they learned about God, and then we go and we apply those into our own life. So we're going to just dive in, and I wonder what God will do with us during this series. David's the character who's mentioned the most in the Bible, and it's interesting to begin with the end in mind. In other words, if you look at the New Testament perspective on David, there's 2 texts that Luke brings out in the story he tells about the Acts of the Apostles. And both of them reflect what people were thinking about David in the New Testament times. So in Acts 13:22, says this, "But God removed Saul and replaced him with David, a man about whom God said," so listen to what God says, "I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do." And then later in the same chapter, in the Message translation says this in verse 36, "David, of course, having completed the work God set out for him in his generation, has been in the grave, dust and ashes, a long time now." So we see these 2 really important phrases: a man after God's own heart, that's what God says, and the fact that David completed the work that God gave him. So he's a shining example that God points to for us to learn from. And this phrase, "a man after God's own heart," is pretty huge. It's a pretty huge descriptor. So we're going to spend 8 weeks asking God to teach us things that we can apply in our own lives from the life of David. Now, let me start with this question. What do you think of when you think about the character of David in the Old Testament? If you're like me, and there's no wrong answers, you think, oh, he was a king. He was a worshiper. He wrote a lot of psalms. He was a songwriter. He was a warrior. And of course, Goliath comes into mind right away. And then often you think of the terrible sin with Bathsheba and the abuse of power And then you think of the civil war he went through, and all the ways that Saul treated him, and all the ways that Absalom, his son, treated. So lots of things come to mind. But we're going to start with the story of David defeating Goliath. I mean, who doesn't love that stories? I think all of us who ever went to Sunday school, that was one of our favorites. And I thought, as I was thinking about this first message, I thought of trying to come up with a real catchy title like Facing the Goliaths in Your Life, or Slaying the Giant, or A Small Stone, ... a Dead Giant, or a religious title like Faith Under Pressure. But in the end, there's only one theme that really jumps out at me as I contemplate the story and think about what we can learn and apply to our own lives, and that is simply this: trusting God in action. This story is about trusting God, and we see it displayed in an amazing action. And it's one thing to say we trust God, it's another thing to do it under extreme pressure. Now, the story's told in 1 Samuel 17, and we know it, so I won't go over too much of it, but the Philistine army was attacking Israel, and King Saul had called out all of the Israelite army, and they were faced off against each other with a little valley in between. And Saul called every man who could fight, and 3 of David's oldest brothers went to the front lines. David was at home caring for the family business, watching the sheep. And David's father sends David to his 3 brothers with a bunch of much-needed provisions. And in the meantime, there was a Philistine giant who had been marching out every day, twice a day, mocking the army of Israel. And he made a challenge for a one-on-one combat that would settle the whole war. That if Goliath won, Israelites would become their slaves. If the Israelites won, the Philistines would become their slaves. Of course, Goliath never believed that there was anyone that could beat him. He was 9 feet tall after all. He was the champion fighter for all of the Philistines and had been a warrior all of his life. So for 40 days, 2 times a day, 80 times total, he came out and made the challenge. And the men of Israel just listened to the taunts, they listened to the insults, but they didn't do anything about it. They were afraid. Now David arrives with his provisions right in time to hear Goliath march out, and he makes this same taunt and everything. And then I'll just pick up a little bit of the story and read some of it to you, because this is where we can really zero in on what's important from this story. Chapter 17, 1 Samuel 17, verse 26. David asked the soldiers standing by, "What will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" Now his brothers hear him say this, and they berate him and tell him to shut up. He's too young, he's too little, he doesn't know what he's doing. But he keeps persisting and asking the question. And when he does that, King Saul hears about him and sends for him. And so David goes in front of the king. Just remember, he's a youth, a lad. He's maybe a young teenager at this point. And he says in verse 32, tells King Saul, "Don't worry about this Philistine. I'll go fight him." And Saul says, "Don't be ridiculous. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. I mean, after all, the slavery of Israel was at stake." He says, "You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth." And then the text says, "But David persisted." He kept saying. And then he goes on, and David says, "I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats, and when a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club, and I rescue the lamb from its mouth. And if the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and I club it to death. And I've done this with both lions and bears. And I'll do it again, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear, and he will rescue me from this Philistine." Well, what a statement. Saul finally says, okay, he consents, go ahead, may the Lord be with you. And he tries to give David his own armor. David puts it on, but it's so heavy and big that he can't even walk in it. And he says, "I can't fight in this," and he just takes it all off. And then he goes and he grabs 5 smooth stones, and then he advances out to face Goliath. And so now this is what happens. Goliath walked out toward David, and he sees David coming, And he starts sneering, and he says in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy, "Am I a dog," he roars at David, "that you come at me with a stick?" And he cursed David by the names of his gods. "Come over here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals," Goliath yelled. David yells back. This is so incredible. He yells back at the Philistine, and he says, "You come at me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come at you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And then listen to this. I mean, this separates the boys from the men. You know, he comes out and he says, "Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head, and then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there's a God in Israel, and everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us." Wow. Okay, that probably made Goliath a little mad, don't you think? And so he starts to move toward David to attack him. And David runs toward him, and as he's running toward him, he reaches in his shepherd's bag, he takes out a stone, and he hurls it with his sling. You know, got to remember, this is a moving target. Goliath is running at him, and it's a perfect shot. He hurls it, and he hits the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sinks into his forehead. Can you imagine the force of that stone? And Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground, dead. And so David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. Then David runs over, and I guess the shield bearer guy that Goliath had with him ran away. Then David ran over and he pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath, this huge sword, and he uses it and he cuts off Goliath's head and holds it up. What a story. What a story. Well, what can you and I learn from that? We're probably not going to be in a battle between a giant with a sword and only having a sling. So what do we learn? Well, I think there's two major lessons. And the first one is simply this. We always need to recognize that there's a bigger reality behind the circumstances of situations where we're in a battle, where we're in a fight. There's always a bigger reality. David didn't look at Goliath through just human natural eyes. He saw the bigger picture. He saw a person that was defying the living God. And he framed this. This was the frame in which he looked at everything. This was not about the armies of the Philistines or the armies of Israel. This was a battle and war between the God of Israel and the gods of the Philistines. David saw that correctly. He recognized it. He saw this conflict this way. And he tells Goliath, "You're defying the living God." And that's what real issue is. You're defying the living God. And God is going to conquer you, he says. "And I will kill you." He says, that's how God is going to conquer you. I will kill you. The humans involved in the story were just humans. There was a giant and there was a shepherd boy. But the real battle was between the God of Israel and the gods of the Philistines. And we see here that there's a bigger reality. Now, we can face a version of this story in our own lives. See, giants in our lives may be our dysfunctional family of origin that crushed us and created walls that separate us from God. Giants in our lives may be the people around us who are actively being used by the enemy to beat us down and attack us. Giants in our own lives may be our own doubts and our own fears and our own insecurities and woundedness. And whatever it is that the enemy uses to enslave you, that can be a giant in your life. And so we face those kind of things in a different way. And so as we apply this truth that there's always a bigger reality in every situation, we need to recognize that this reality is really a battle between God's plan for us and the enemy's plan for us. Those are who's really battle is going on. You see, God's plan for us is rooted in love, and he wants us to experience his love. The enemy's desires for us, his plan is rooted in evil. It's rooted in darkness. It's rooted on doing anything he can to separate us from relationship with God and from experiencing the love of God. And that's the bigger reality in every conflict where we're in battle, we're in warfare, where we're facing down the giants in our own lives. And so we need to always remember that there's a bigger reality and see whatever's going on in light of it. The second point is simply this. Trust is always the foundation of our faith. Trusting God is what activates God to fight on our behalf. And the reality is that you can't have faith in something or someone that you don't trust. So trust is an integral part of faith. Trust itself is reliance. It's relying on something. It's confidence and it's hope and expectation that creates hope and the reliance that creates hope. And so, kind of makes me ask the simple question. It's a bit of a rabbit trail, but where did David learn to trust God? Remember the context. Remember Eli and Samuel, the priests of those days did not have a very strong connection to God. There was not a lot of God activity going on. There had been 400 years of judges and flashes of God's delivering power through them. Samuel had emerged as an anointed man of God, a prophet, but there wasn't a strong connection that we know of. We don't know anything about the faith of Jesse or the faith in David's family. And so we simply don't know how David developed his faith and trust in God. What we do know is when it happened, his trust in God developed as he was taking care of the sheep and the goats and protecting them from these bears and these lions. We know where it happened. It was out in the wilderness with the sheep by himself. That's where he somehow met God. And God, he trusted in God as he protected the sheep. And God delivered him from lions and bears and all these kind of things. Oh my. And here's the deal. Experience where trust is validated, we put our trust in something and it's validated, is what builds more trust. That's how we build more trust. And as we apply this, trusting God, we have to recognize it begins with a choice. It begins with a decision. And growing trust, getting more trust, requires going through experiences where our trust in God is validated. And, well, I do have to mention this, that to get really strong trust, powerful trust, the kind of trust that takes down giants like Goliath, is only learned in situations where we're most vulnerable, and we can't depend on anything else. We can't rely on anyone else. We can't depend on anything else or rely on anything else. That's where we really grow amazingly strong trust. And that's not easy to go through those. So that's what we need to learn in this first lesson from David. It's what we learn from him and lions, bears, and giants. Wow, David, thank you for helping us learn to see the bigger picture and to grow our trust in God. Well, God be with you. Looking forward to the next one as we jump into the next week, but this is enough to get us started. Lord, thank you for this time. Thank you for this word. Thank you for this example. And we ask, Lord, that you would teach us through the life of David how to always see the bigger picture and how to grow our trust in you and how to put our trust in you when we face the giants in our own lives. Thank you, Lord, for your amazing presence that walks us through and helps us. In Jesus' name, amen.